Good afternoon, everyone, and very nice to be with you today. My name is Sean Nazerali. I am the Director of Innovative Financing at BIOFUND, the Mozambican Foundation for the Conservation of Biodiversity. So thanks for having me here, and I have a brief presentation about BIOFUND as a model for conservation trust funds in the region. First of all, just who we are. BIOFUND is as I mentioned, it's a foundation under Mozambican law, so it's a national organization with public utility status. We are a membership organization, so we have more than 50 members, both individuals and conservation organizations are part of BIOFUND, with a mission focused on the sustainable financing of conservation. We are a founding member and board member currently of the African Environmental Funds Network, which extends across currently 19 or 20 different funds within Africa. The trust fund model is not entirely new. It's been around since the late 80s or the 90s. There's now, I think, more than 80 or 90 of these funds around the world, as you can see. Dispersing large amounts of financing across the world. Within Africa, as I mentioned, the members stretch from north to south and east to west. I won't go into the great detail of our history. We've been around for about 10, 11 years now. Normally these funds, they take 2 years or so in sort of conceptual development and so on, and we are no exception with that. After that, there was a sort of founding period where we set up a founding committee, got ourselves together. That took another 2 years with some support from WWF, AFD, and KFW. And then we were created in 2011. This then resulted in about 4 years of startup and organization. We were doing fundraising, we were doing development of institutional paperwork and so on, and be ready to receive our first donations, which we got at the end of 2015. We started at the beginning of 2015, and then we started giving out money in 2016 with a very small amount. We did some pilot funding for a couple of years, and then we started to grow. So we function on the basis of our newest strategic plan, which has 4 pillars. The first of which is our core business, which is financing conservation. Pillar number 2 is focused on the second part of that mission as a financing entity to mobilize resources for conservation. Recognizing we can't, however, operate in a vacuum, we need to work on the enabling environment for conservation. And so we have a whole pillar, a third pillar based on advocacy, education, awareness raising, and so on. And then finally, an internally focused pillar on BIOFUND itself, making sure that we continue to be an efficient, effective, and obviously transparent organization. Briefly, the different aspects that we can bring to the table and have brought to the table in terms of our financing of conservation. You can see here the growth of our disbursement in millions of dollars. We have up to date spent about $23 million in conservation, a little bit more today. That part of which, maybe 10%, has come from our endowment revenues, and the rest has come from what we call pass-through funds or project funds that are coming from other donors. And you can see on the left, in terms of the map, again, we have a national scope. We give away to protected areas from north to south, east to west. In fact, all the protected areas that are under public management, with exception of one, are now beneficiaries of BIOFUND, and that one should be a beneficiary by the end of this year. Mobilizing funds has obviously been a great strength for us. We have grown both in number of donors over the years and also in the value. I want to talk a little bit first about our endowment, because it's really the endowment that makes a trust fund a different animal. It's something that really allows us to be called a sustainable financing mechanism. So how does it work? The endowment itself is invested. It's a pure amount of capital that we are investing in international capital markets. We don't do it directly. We hire a professional investment manager. At the moment, it's Deutsche Bank for us, and our money is based in New York. That then provides us with an annual income of 4% net return. And that's for programs and costs of running those programs. The great thing about the endowment is that's not just this year, but next year, and the year after, and every other year after that, permanently maintaining the value of our original capital. And that's what allows us to say we're a sustainable financing mechanism, we're a long-term partner, and in fact allows us to say to the protected areas, when BIOFUND enters, we never leave. We can make that commitment to today, tomorrow, and forever. And the endowment is what makes that happen. You can see the growth of our endowment's been reasonably good. It dropped a little bit in 22 with the oscillation of the financial markets, but in general it's been rising over time, both from contributions and from actual increase in the value of our investments, and it now stands at just under $55 million. Pass-through funds or project funds is also a really, really important part. To date, we've raised nearly $150 million from funds from a wide variety of different international partners, but currently we get money from World Bank, European Union, Swedes, the French, the Germans, the Americans. Really, basically anyone who's devoting money to biodiversity is now funneling either partially or entirely their contribution to biodiversity via the BIOFUND mechanism, given the fact that we already set up procedures to manage funds, oversee their correct use, monitor results, and of course work with all the different entities, both state and non-state actors who work in conservation. We're a very clear added value for most of these donors. We do occasionally do direct implementation of projects, not very often, but generally we are a financing entity. But on a couple of areas, and I would bring together here the education and conservation. So we have what we call Mozambique Conservation Leaders Program. I'll speak briefly about that later, but it's basically focusing on attracting and retaining new young people to conservation as a career. And then on innovative financial mechanisms. With this, we are involved in developing, incubating, and then piloting new financial mechanisms that can bring in more long-term financing for conservation within the country. Within that, obviously, the goal is to generate long-term new financing and diversify the sources of revenues. We're highly dependent on international organizations and institutions at the moment, and so we need to broaden and diversify those sources of revenue. Here's a few of them we talk about. So we incubate and we look at the feasibility of these different ones, and then we try to see which can be relevant and useful for Mozambique. One I like to highlight is biodiversity offsets. Now, this is an approach that we call harmonizing economic development and biodiversity conservation. On the map on your left, you can see all those blue squares and pink squares and gray squares are all different types of mining or oil and gas concessions that are throughout the country. In fact, the map is a little bit out of date. It's even worse than it looks like now. And this means more than half the country is already being concessioned out for mining, or at least prospection for mining licenses, which is a huge threat for us in the long term. Biodiversity offsets is, really simply speaking, a mechanism to ensure full compensation for impacts on biodiversity. And it's compensation in kind, so it's not just a pay to pollute kind of scheme. It's, if you've destroyed a forest, you need to replace a forest, and the same kind of forest with the same kind of biodiversity as the one that you impacted. So it's really based on real impacts rather than sort of projected impacts, and it's also based on real results being achieved. So as a potential on a global scale, biodiversity offsets are now providing more money to biodiversity conservation than all the multilaterals and bilaterals can serve. So really a huge amount of money is being now invested by private companies. Unfortunately, for us here on this continent, the majority of that is going in places like Australia, the United States, Europe, and so on, which have these legislative instruments in place. So we've been working here in Mozambique to develop that legislative framework, and I'm pleased to announce that as of last year, we now have a full regulation on how to implement biodiversity offsets. And speaking to the ministry this week, they are going to put it into full implementation and start requiring it from all projects as of January 2024. Other innovative financing mechanisms, we're doing some feasibility studies on water ecosystem services in Chimanimani National Park, that's up in the border region next to Zimbabwe, looking at how sedimentation can be reduced in one of the dams that provides electricity to the country, and therefore they could pay for that sedimentation to be reduced. We have a long-standing collaboration, 5-6 years now, with the largest commercial bank, the BCI Bank, which has a biodegradable debit card, which we get a certain percentage of those revenues each year. We now have over 50,000 users in the country, and it brings us over $100,000 in revenue every single year. We've developed some really new innovative mechanisms and delivery vehicles over the years. One of the most innovative we did, or most impactful we did, was the emergency biofund that we set up during COVID. This was really to help the private sector operators who were totally dependent on tourism income for their operations to survive in the period when tourism went from really overnight to zero. And we were requested by the private sector to come in, and we came in initially paying half their salaries on a monthly basis, and then after a few months we took over and paid the full salaries of their rangers for about a year and a half until the tourism market was reopened and they could reestablish themselves and have an income and cash flow again. This allowed us to work in 25 different conservation areas across the country. More than 12 million hectares of biodiversity was supported nearly 1,000 rangers through this program, either through full salaries, about 600 of them, and then the rest with operating costs like fuel and food rations to keep them functional. And it cost about $3 million, but it was really, really quick, and it was because we had our own money. So we were requested in May support, our board approved it in June, in July we paid salaries. We pulled $1 million out of our endowment immediately and said there's no point in sitting in the bank doing nothing when we have this need. Then we had other donors who came on and joined us, and they added the rest of the money that we eventually used for it. But that took 9 months or 10 months before we actually got the funds in our hand. So it was being on the ground with our own cash that we could make our own decisions about that really allowed us to be that kind of really rapid, flexible response to the needs of the sector. And you can see those are the beneficiaries, once again, north to south, east to west, in lots of different types of areas. We have a bunch of new initiatives we're working on now. We have a climate emergency response fund we launched in 2022. It's focusing on early response inside protected areas to allow them to purchase materials at the last moment to protect assets when a cyclone is coming, for example, or to shore them up immediately afterwards to make sure they don't get further damaged with rains and so on right after an event has passed. We're beginning impact investment in businesses that are conservation friendly, or in fact, even more than conservation compatible, but are pro-conservation businesses like game farming and other fauna industry is where we're starting with both communities and with the private sector. We are currently been selected to be the convening agent for the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, so across the marine side, also trying to mobilize private sector finance to reef-positive businesses across the country. And we've just signed, or we're just in the process of signing, a new agreement with the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is a branch of the US government funding, to do community livelihoods and climate resilience in the Zambezia province. So that's another $50 million of funds to come in over the next 5 to 7 years. Now, all this money is great, but we need to do more than that. We need to also work on advocacy and on education, making sure that people understand why conservation is important, and making sure we have people who can then implement good conservation programs. And so one of the things we've been doing, we have a long-running biodiversity exhibition that goes around the country and has been in a number of different places. We kind of changed its format during COVID and are now working in a hybrid with collaborating with a wide variety of different stakeholders in biodiversity awareness raising. We have the Mozambique Conservation Leadership Program that I spoke of earlier. This is both to improve the capacity of professionals who are already in the system, as well as to attract new people. And we do that either by helping students go out in do their theses in protected areas so they can figure out what it's like, or we actually then send people out for 6 months or a year as interns into the protected area network and send them out to have a real experience, both contributing with knowledge, but at the same time finding out if conservation on the ground is really something that they want to be into. And then giving that exposure, they can also quickly be hired by the people that we are interning them out to. And really, we've spent 220 odd interns have gone out. Roughly 35% of them are hired right out of the program, with another number being hired in the months that follow once they finish. We're sharing biodiversity data. We have the largest repository of biodiversity data in Mozambique online. 2,500 odd pieces of information that can all be freely accessed by anybody who wants them. And in order to do that, we need to be a good, strong organization. Now, this team is not all of us. This is a whole lot of our stakeholders as well. This was at our Christmas gathering, in fact. So this is our board, our members, a number of our key partners as well, all coming together. But we are now we're over 40 people. We're about 45 people in the institution as I speak. We have grown immensely in the 10 years, and I think you can see that while it was a slow start, it has really proven an incredibly valuable contribution for the Mozambican conservation scheme. We are a national organization that functions on international levels of performance and accountability, and that allows us to really be a key player in the conservation world. So, thanks very much for your attention. I just wanted to bring attention at the end here with this lovely image of fisheries, that really we consider conservation as a development pathway. And in fact, within Mozambique, a country where 80%, 90% perhaps of the population is directly dependent on natural resources for their day-to-day living, conservation and enriching those natural resources is in fact a development initiative. Here we don't tend to phrase it as either conservation or development, but in fact conservation as development. And that's the message I want to leave you with finally at the end of that. So thanks very much for your time, and welcome any questions you might have.